Hello everyone and welcome to the MS-DOS project. Today we'll be talking about another game in the Ultima series, Ultima Underworld. The period between the release of Ultima VI and Ultima VII was one of huge growth, change, and experimentation, both for Origin systems and PC gaming as a whole. In the hardware space, the Intel 486 processor was released in late 1989 and began to gain lots of market share in the PC space, and with 33 MHz clock speed, it allowed for more powerful games than ever. Sound Blaster audio cards began to come out in 1990, as well as VGA quickly becoming the de facto video standard. All of these hardware upgrades allowed the IBM PC platform that Origin had shifted over to be able to support projects that would have been unthinkable just a year or two prior. At Origin, they would strike gold with a new series, Wing Commander. The company had explored space combat games with titles such as Space Rogue and even Ultima I, but this was a whole new paradigm, with proper textures to show movement and 3D rotation of objects in space. This wasn't the only genre they had pushing the limits of 3D in, however, as soon Origin would find themselves co-producing a groundbreaking Ultima title in the third dimension. The project that eventually became Ultima Underworld did not even start as an Ultima game, or even really at Origin Systems. Paul Neurath was a programmer who had contracted with Origin to develop the aforementioned Space Rogue. Space Rogue combined 3D spaceflight elements with a traditional top-down RPG. But soon after completing it, Neurath wanted to do more with the 3D elements to make a more seamless experience. Of course, right away, Neurath had to face an issue that developers had been unable to conquer for the last decade or so. Most computer hardware simply could not map complicated textures onto 3D objects. Rendering plain 3D objects in single colors was fine for flight or space simulators where you were generally far away from the details. But to attempt to make a computer RPG in true 3D would soon expose these very poor-looking objects. A compromise had been made for games such as the Bard's Tale, Might and Magic, and even Dungeons of earlier Ultima games to simply lock movement to the 4 cardinal directions, and thus essentially only have to render a 2D scene once. Neurath, however, wanted to do something no one else had done before, attempt to have a realistic-looking dungeon crawler that gave the player full freedom of movement. Of course, the problem of 3D texture mapping still had to be overcome. Luckily for him, a friend from his undergraduate days, Ned Lerner, knew of a solution. Working at the company Lerner had founded, a gifted developer, Chris Green, had been seeking to solve these problems himself, as he had worked for years on flight simulators and other similar projects. Green believed that the new Intel CPUs were capable of it, and although he had written a fairly efficient texture mapper for them, it still had tons of performance issues and could hardly be used in a game that relied on fast action or reflexes. His compromise became an industry standard until 3D rendering technologies caught up, known as affine texture mapping. Essentially, when mapping these textures in 3D space, you need to take into account the z-coordinate, or how far away an object is in 3D space, in order to scale the texture properly. Well, Green basically just decided to throw this away, and map the textures onto the polygons as if they were in a 2D space. It yielded an enormous increase in render speed, with a downside of some distortion depending on perspective and proximity to objects. This is noticeable in Ultima Underworld, and as the technique is used heavily by the PlayStation 1, in many of those games it is noticeable as well. It did, however, mean that these types of games were now possible. Ted Lerner was more than happy to share his discovery with Paul Neurath, and upon seeing it, decided to form a team to tackle his project. The small team consisted of Neurath, Doug Church, who was an undergraduate at MIT before joining the project, and Doug Weick, an artist who had worked for Origin before they fully left New Hampshire. This trio would become Blue Sky Studios, and eventually Looking Glass, responsible for many cutting-edge games over the next decade. At this point, however, they were basically a 3-man operation, and needed to script together a demo of what they wanted to do quickly in order to attract a publisher and thus funds to actually create the game. So in a matter of a few weeks, they put together a rough demo of a character moving down a texture-mapped hallway and running into a monster, just in time for them to show off at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show. Once at CES, most publishers were not impressed. They doubted that the team could actually turn their proof of concept into a real game, and thus dismissed it out of hand. However, one of Neurath's friends from Origin immediately became a champion for the game. Warren Spector loved the idea, and was convinced it was so important that he got the rest of management on board to sign a contract with Blue Sky and forward them $30,000, despite the fact that they had killed off contracted development in the last year or so. Spector was so convinced this would get them in on the ground floor of something massive, and even if it didn't pan out, $30,000 was a small enough sum for the company that it couldn't really hurt to provide the funding. Immediately, the small team got back to work, doing their best to figure out how to make this rendering engine and game a reality. From the get-go, Paul Neurath wanted to distinguish from something like Dungeon Master by making sure that your character had a real presence in the game world. Of this philosophy, Neurath said, "We wanted to get a feeling that you were really in this dungeon. What would you expect to do in a dungeon? You might need to jump across a narrow chasm. You might expect to batter down a wooden door. You might expect to look up if there was a precipice above you. All these sorts of physical activities. And we tried to achieve, at least to a reasonable degree, that kind of freedom of motion and freedom of action. That really extended the research and development stage. It was about 9 months, even a year, before we had all the underlying technology in place that allowed us to visualize this fantasy universe in a manner that we felt was appropriate and would work well, and would allow the player the freedom to maneuver around and perform different kinds of actions. Close quote. As we will see in the gameplay portion of this review, the team was largely successful in this objective, and even in representing a lot of these activities he described. However, there were still a lot of hurdles to overcome before getting to that point. Despite the skill of the team at Blue Sky, it was apparent that they would need to hire more people in order to turn this into a working project, and to finish in enough time to be able to replace the $30,000 that they would quickly spend. Luckily, Doug Church had several friends who had just recently graduated, or were close to doing so, and were willing to work for cheap. And of course, Narath was more than happy to have them on the team. This came also with the boon that most of these team members had hardly touched a computer game in 4 or 5 years due to their rigorous MIT coursework, and thus didn't feel the need to try to follow any of the existing conventions, and instead just try to do things in a way that would make sense. Throughout this entire development, Blue Sky was still a hodgepodge group of programmers. While at this point Origin was very firm in subdivision of roles and structured development, Blue Sky looked more like the Origin of yesteryear, with everyone kind of just doing a bit of everything. In fact, most of the recent graduates just shared a house in Cambridge, and worked on the project day and night instead of coming into Blue Sky offices in New Hampshire. Apparently, there was a point about a year into development that the game almost died. There was a scenario where Origin would have walked away from the game, Narath said in an interview for GameDeveloper.com. Roughly 1 year into development, Origin became unsure of the game's focus on action. The article goes on to say that, quote, "On a performance level, Narath is blunt. The frame rate sucked. The game's pre-alpha version could reach 15 frames per second performance on a commercial 386 PC on a good day," he says, but it more typically ran lower than 10 FPS, and the adventure how you want aspect of the gameplay still wasn't gelling. These immersive sins tend to come together late, Narath says, pointing to a similar development issues in series like Thief and Deus Ex. Apparently, things got so desperate that Blue Sky had to look for another source of cash flow so they could provide more of their own funding, but still have Origin publish it. To this end, the team accepted a contract to port Madden 93 to Sega Genesis for Electronic Arts. This did end up being a successful enough venture to fund them and convince Origin to stay committed to the project. Eventually, things started to take more shape, with actual dungeon floors being designed and linked together and characters created. But the game was still in a sort of limbo on the publisher side, as Origin basically didn't talk to them over the first 18 months or so of development, until Warren Spector was freed up from his work on Worlds of Ultima Martian Dreams and took over the project, helping steer it to completion. It was at this time that the Ultima brand became attached, and Ultima Underworld was the final title. Of course, this meant that a lot of dialogue had to be rewritten to reflect that world and other changes made, but in the end it proved worthwhile as it saved the game from relative obscurity. Spector proved to be a guiding force on the project in many ways. He helped to pare down some of the more complicated systems for ease of use, and always was providing feedback on what would and wouldn't be fun for a player, regardless of how fun it was for the programmers themselves to create. He would integrate himself very fully with the team, moving with them to a new office in Boston in order to get the project shipped in time. The whole team became very close, and they even poked fun of Warren a bit. At one point they had a meeting with an action item being, quote, "need to include a Warren Spector cameo," at which point one of the members shouted, "Done!" and they had no further discussion, leading to confusion on Spector's part. It turns out that this cameo is a non-aggressive Spectre in the game named Warren, a very clever play on words. The game was on the cutting edge, and thus failed in some ways. The movement system is a little clunky, as nothing like this had really been done before. The team even implemented view bombing after experimenting with just running around with a camcorder, but Narath said that after Doom came out it was obvious that they could have done a lot of the movement things much better. He also wished they could have made things more immersive by allowing things like damage to be affected by momentum instead of stats, like how it is in Dungeons & Dragons, and he felt this was much better done in System Shock a few years later. If you want to see my review and history on System Shock, you can click the link in the corner. Eventually the game did release in March of 1992, and although it had to compete with Ultima VII of that year for sales, it quickly gained a popularity of its own, with sales eventually reaching 500,000 copies. Similarly, it received tons of critical praise for the groundbreaking engine and gameplay, and was seen as a new frontier by critics and gamers alike. This would lead to a sequel starting development not long after, and of course Blue Sky, and then Looking Glass going on to create lots of other amazing games in the coming decade. One thing to note about the release is that it beat Wolfenstein 3D to the market by over a month, which of course was the direct predecessor to the ever-popular Doom. Both these games were huge steps forward for 3D and first-person gaming, and I'll try to note some of the ways in which the Underworld engine compares and actually surpasses even that of Doom, which came out the next year, with some key trade-offs of course. In fact, it turns out that just Underworld being developed influenced the existence of these games. As David Kushner recalls in his book, Masters of Doom, quote, "Romero heard about texture mapping from Paul Neurath. Neurath told Ron Romero that they were applying texture mapping to shapes or polygons in a three-dimensional world. Cool, Romero thought. When he hung up the phone, he spun his chair to John Cormack and said, "Paul said he's doing a game using texture mapping." "Texture mapping," Carmack replied, then took a few seconds to spin the concept around in his head. "I can do that." Close quote. It's super interesting to learn not only did John Romero work at Origin in the late 80s, but the people he got to know there helped influence some of the most popular games of all time that he ended up developing later on. As an Origin published game, the physical product that gamers received when buying Ultima Underworld was top-notch. The front cover has a gorgeous art that really emphasizes the dungeon crawler atmosphere of the game. The back has several screenshots showing off different aspects of the game, which is definitely a big plus, as at the time this was an entirely new kind of game that needed a lot of explanation. In the box is of course the game on several floppy disks, 4 3.5-inch ones in my case. Along with that is the game manual, titled The Memoirs of Sir Cabrius, which details all about the Abyss where the game takes place. In addition, you get a nice looking paper map of the first level of the Abyss, and a small bag of runes akin to the ones you collect in the game to use in Magic. And of course the regular product, catalogs, and registration materials. There also appears to be a reference card and player guide which I'm missing, but it's all there on the GOG version of the game. There is also a clue book available that is narrated by the game's antagonist, which is pretty funny and a helpful read if you get stuck. An excellent product as always, and one I am more than happy to have sitting on my shelf. The installation is fairly straightforward, mostly just asking you for a few sound options and the location where you want the game to be installed. Most of the other options are configurable in-game, so I will talk about those in a little bit. Once you boot up the game, you see the Blue Sky and Origin Systems logos, and then this cool stylized game title. After these short title cards, you're dropped onto a fairly simple menu. The options here are simply Introduction, Create Character, Acknowledgements, and Journey Onward. I'll show the introduction and character creation in a second. Acknowledgements is just a very simple credits in a stylized font that you can click through at your own leisure, and Journey Onward lets you choose from 1 to 4 available save slots to load into. Pretty simple, but it gets the job done. Of course, before starting the game, you'll want to watch the introduction. Here it is.
At last, you are asleep. For 3 nights, each attempt to rest has brought you starting from your bed in fright, with no memory of what horrified you so. With a sickening sense of deja vu, you begin to dream.
Treachery and doom! My brother would unleash a great evil. Britannia is in peril!
Sure that the ghost can take you to Britannia, you allow yourself to be drawn to him.
A visitor, and from far away indeed. No matter, thou shalt serve to draw the hounds from the scent.
Below, a creature heads toward the dark woods, a thrashing sack slung over its massive shoulder.
What hast thou done with our lord's daughter Ariel? Dropped her below to an accomplice, I'll wager. Well, he'll nigh escape us, and when we bring him back, he'll both hang.
Several tense hours later, you are dragged before Baron Ulmric. Ignoring you, Ulmric questions his captain.
What news, Corwin?
Forgive us, my lord. The foul creature escaped. A score of us gave chase, but it fled into the Stygian abyss with poor Ariel. We were attacked, goblins and worse, my lord. Only 3 of us survived.
I see.
The Baron turns his hard grey eyes upon you.
I was warned of thy coming. Last fortnight, an apparition of an old, haggard man appeared in my dreams. Guard thy daughter well, it warned, for an evil one shall come to steal her away. I posted guards at Ariel's door, but still you took her from me. They say thou didst drop her to a troll waiting below. What sayest thou?
You explain that you are the Avatar, and that you are innocent.
Whether thou speak truth or falsehood, I cannot say. Stories tell of the coming of the Avatar, but years have passed since he visited here. If thou art truly the Avatar, then perhaps thou canst offer hope. None here can survive the Stygian abyss and rescue Ariel. My mind is set. Corwin shall take thee to the abyss. Return here with my daughter, and thy innocence shall be proven. If thou dost not return, Avatar, then thy lies shall have brought thee low.
This be the foul pit's only entrance. Once it is locked, none can pass. I will shut thee in and stand guard till I hear Ariel's voice from within. Otherwise, 'twill remain shut forever.
Honestly, this introduction is just okay. It gets the point across, but the voice acting, even with Richard Garriott being the narrator, is kind of mediocre. It's cool to have a fully voiced intro, but honestly I could take or leave the actual voice acting. Now I do think it's funny that the Duke somehow doesn't recognize you at all. It's not clear how long it has been since you left Britannia in Ultima VI, but come on, the Avatar is the literal multi-time savior of the world and basically prophet of the religion. You think you would have seen a statue or a painting at some point? Another thing is that apparently the Abyss is within walking distance of his castle. The Abyss that is only accessible on the Isle of Avatar, which you could really only land on by means of a small stream. So at some point after Ultima VI, this dude just built a fort on this island, I guess, and is calling himself a duke now. Maybe that's why he hasn't heard of me. He's a fraud. Still, none of that changes the fact that we are now stuck down here and have to save his daughter. And we start with absolutely nothing to help us. Guess he doesn't really care enough to give his daughter a fighting chance. I would ask if there was no right to appeal in this game, as you would think if I could just have my case tried by Lord British, this would all get sorted out, but it's pretty apparent to me this guy's just a fraud of a duke anyways. After that introduction, you will need to create a character to start the game. You can choose to be a male or a female, which appears to be entirely cosmetic. Same with handedness. I think it just affects which hand your attacking weapon goes in, and which side of the screen it shows up on when you go into attack mode. The next choice is probably your most important all game, your class. These seem to fit all the normal classes that have been around since at least Ultima 4, with fighters being stronger, mages having higher intelligence, paladins being a good balance of all of those, etc. There does seem to be quite a bit of randomization in character generation, as across several character generation attempts using the same exact options, the stats were a bit different each time. Thus, if you want your stats to be slightly different, you can re-roll your character to try again. But I said this was the most important decision you need to make, and here's why. There are no chances to increase your base stats later on. What you start with is what you get, unless I missed some way to boost these things later on, but I didn't see any indication of such anywhere online. This ended up biting me in the butt, as strength dictates carry weight, and I started with pretty crummy strength, which meant I was eventually crippled by all the stuff I had to carry, and didn't have the choice of all the best armor I could get. Dexterity is important for chance to hit, and intelligence for magic casting, but both of these things can be upgraded through other skills, whereas carrying capacity is basically set in stone from the beginning. After your class, the next few choices are less critical but still important. You get to choose whether you want to boost attack or defense, combat proficiency, and a different skill to start with a boost in. A lot of this comes down to personal preference and how you want to play the game, but absolutely avoid missiles, as projectile weapons are basically useless in this game. No Skyrim-style stealth archer gameplay for you today. A lot of these non-combat skills end up being close to or entirely useless as well, but I will touch on that a bit later. After these choices, you get to choose from 5 funny-looking character portraits and then your name. If you're good with the person you've created, you get dropped right into the game. The character creator gets the job done. It has a lot less character than previous Ultimas, pardon the pun, but it does exactly what you need it to. And with that, we enter the Stygian Abyss. The game calls it Stygian, but I think it's Stygian, probably closer to the river Styx. The very first thing we see is, well, the interface. There's a lot going on here, and it's not all super obvious what it does or tells you at first glance, so I'll do my best to break it down, as a lot of it isn't immediately apparent. Starting in the very middle is the main view screen. This, of course, shows the game world from the perspective of your character. There are some other things that go on here besides just viewing and interacting directly with the world, but I'll get to those in a little while. Moving to the left side of the screen is your actions menu, which allows you to switch between interaction modes very easily. Sort of what we had in Ultima VI and the games on that engine previously at the bottom of the screen. The top button is the pause menu, and this is easily one of the best parts of the game from a quality of life perspective, as it allows you to do some adjustment on the fly, which is impressive for a game in 1992. The game pauses completely well in this menu, so you don't need to worry about getting attacked while shuffling through options. The first 2 options of save and restore a game are very simple, allowing you to have 4 separate name save files at a time. And this is a first for us in this series. Having the ability to have more than one save slot and to be able to name them is huge. In this case, it can be particularly helpful, as it is possible to get stuck in an unwinnable state, but more on that later. The next two buttons are fairly simple, allowing you to turn sound effects and music on and off at will. I never did, but I guess if you got tired of hearing the music after a while, you could turn it off and play your own while you play. The next option is not really relevant now, but it definitely was when it came out, and that is detail. As I talked about in my introduction, texture mapping in a full 3D space hadn't really been done before in a game, and for a good reason. It was typically really hardware intensive. Even with the shortcuts and techniques Blue Sky used, it would still require high-end hardware to run well. The 486 was barely becoming mainstream, so many gamers likely were using chips that clocked below 33 MHz. What the detail features actually does is cut down on the amount of texture mapping in the game, with the lowest level of detail, basically just disabling it entirely, and using single color polygons. This is definitely not the intended experience, and it's more just something bizarre and funny to look at now, but I'm sure there are many kids who played this game when it came out like this and enjoyed it immensely. For emulation and even most DOS systems you'd attempt to play this on, you can always just leave it on very high. The last two options are to return to the game and quit. Simple, but it is nice to have all these buttons in a graphical interface, instead of being keyboard commands like in previous games. Heading back to the main sidebar, we have our interaction modes. Speak is fairly simple as it allows you to talk to NPCs in shrines and a few other things throughout the game. The next one is the get mode, which allows you to pick up, drop, move around, and even throw items. And yes, you can toss items out in front of you and they are affected by realistic physics. In fact, the physics engine in this game is really impressive and was definitely a point of pride for the developers, but I will cover it in depth when I talk more about gameplay. The eye-looking icon is the look mode, which allows you to read signs and get item descriptions as well as that of NPCs and monsters. Fairly basic, but from time to time looking at an item can tell you a lot more about it than you would know just at first glance with your eyes. The sword icon represents combat mode, which simply pulls out your weapon allowing you to attack when clicking, and the last icon is the use mode, which allows you to use items in your inventory as well as click buttons, pull chains, and open doors. Moving further down, we have this gem looking thing the reference calls the power gem. It seems entirely cosmetic at first, but knowing what it tells you will go a long way to making the game a much more enjoyable experience. I think the card puts it best, saying, quote, "In combat, the gem glows red, then yellow, then green, then sparkles as you put more power into an attack." Essentially, it shows you how charged up your attack is, and you will want to use this, as attacks that are not charged up to green seem to have a much lower chance to hit and do less damage, meaning that you will miss a lot and not really understand why you aren't doing any damage. It kind of reminds me of the experience of going into Morrowind the first time and not understanding why you were missing every single swing.
I'm not giving up that easily.
At the bottom of the screen is your scroll, which shows things like item descriptions and feedback on certain actions. This is definitely akin to what we had in previous Ultima games, especially Ultima VI, and is useful to keep track of. It also displays your dialogue options when conversing with NPCs, while their dialogue appears on the main view screen along with portraits of your character and whoever you are talking to. Between the main view and the scroll is the compass, which mostly just shows you where north is with a red mark on one arrow, which is infinitely helpful when navigating the current dungeons. However, if you click on the compass, it will print a report onto the scroll of your current status and how many game days it has been since you started, as well as time of day. The time of day doesn't really matter as there aren't any NPC schedules as far as I could tell, and it's all in the abyss anyway, meaning no sunshine. But it's interesting to know. There are also arrows beneath the compass that can be used to move your character, but moving via clicking is just not a good way to do it when you're able to use the regular W, A, S, and D keys. To the right directly above the scroll are your health and mana flasks, in red and blue respectively. These normally just show how much health or magic points you have, but if the avatar gets poisoned, the health flask will turn green to reflect that. They also have cool animated bubbling effects while replenishing or depleting, so it's a fun little immersive bit of HUD to have. The last major piece is the inventory screen on the right. A bit similar to the one seen in the VIII engine games, it has the cool effect of displaying the armor pieces you equip directly on your character, something that the mainline Ultima games wouldn't do until Serpent Isle the next year. You have a few slots for a sword, shield or offhand item, back storage, and a backpack. Interestingly enough, you can have items just out in your inventory outside of the backpack, just kinda in your pockets, I guess, but having a backpack and bags inside of it to organize is definitely helpful. If you click on the chain, you get your screen of stats, including individual skills, which I will discuss in depth in a little while. Also, reading the reference card, I came to find out that the eye color of the gargoyle at the top of the screen indicates enemy health, with green being the strongest and red about to die. I wish I would have known this much earlier, as it would have made it a lot easier to gauge how well I actually was doing in combat. I am a fan of this skeuomorphic or diegetic interface, an interface where real objects are used to display information instead of just plain text and numbers. But in a few spots it could be a bit more easy to follow or understand. However, it probably would have been if I'd actually read the guide at the start, like I should have. Now that we've gotten to grips with the interface a little bit, it's time to actually start playing the game. And you start with absolutely nothing. No knife, no clothes, not even a sack with some food in it. You're basically just in your pajamas, and the Duke expects you to try to help his daughter with no help. Honestly, it feels like this is more of an execution at this point. Luckily, right where you start is a small bag with some items to start you out, including probably the most important one to help you finish the game: the map. In order to be able to use the in-game map, you need to have the actual item, so you'll want to make sure you never ever drop it, as I don't think there's another one in the entire game. And this may be one of the best maps to ever exist in a video game. The map covers all 8 levels of the Abyss that you can explore, and you can freely switch between levels of the map at any time. The map of each floor starts blank, however, and areas only fill in as you explore or find them. This gives you a real sense of progression as you start from nothing, and get to slowly find out how expansive everything is and how many hidden and cool areas there are. The really cool and handy part, however, is the map allows you to take notes and mark anywhere on the map. This makes it so much easier to keep track of where important locations, items, and characters are at, without the game having to do it for you. This also means you can mark potential stashes of items you create and more. Why more games don't include this, I'm not sure, but I would love to see this note-taking feature in every game I play. Another item you'll quickly encounter is a bag of runes. This is how you access magic in this game. Unlike in mainline Ultima titles thus far, where magic has been accessed through the use of reagents, magical ingredients, mixed to cast spells from a spellbook, here you must use runestones to prepare a spell before casting. As before, the spells are sorted into 8 circles, but since the level cap in the game is level 16, you can only cast spells that are of the circle that is equal to half your level rounded up. This means that if your character is a level 5, you will only be able to cast spells that are in the circle 3 or lower. All the spells and rune combinations can be found in the user guide. Clicking on the bag will bring up this special interface that shows all the rune, and selecting a rune will queue it up in the 3 slots below, and when you click on it you will attempt to cast it. The spell costs 3 times as much mana as the circle it comes from, meaning a level 5 spell will cost 15 mana. You only start out with a few runes, meaning only a few spells, and grabbing more will be one of the most important things you will do in your playthrough. Even if you're playing a light magic playthrough, the healing spells are definitely a must. It's often the easiest way to heal, as food is scarce enough in the game and sometimes you will just need to heal in the middle of battle. There are also spell scrolls which you can get that will cost no mana or require any skill, but will give you the same effect as the respective spell by using up the scroll. One thing you will probably notice while playing is that the normal WASD controls aren't quite the same as you may expect. We are used to the A and D keys being left and right strafe, meaning your character just kind of side shuffles. But here, they simply rotate your character left and right. Also, the S key just moves your character slowly forward, while W moves forward at a faster pace. Thus, the Z, X, and C keys take the place of the A, S, and D keys, though they are much slower at strafing and moving backward than you might expect. This is a weird control scheme for modern day, but even using the WASD setup was very forward-looking, as most games use just the arrow keys as default, which is very awkward while also using a mouse. Another weird quirk is that jump is mapped to the J key, so the several sequences which will require platforming, and yes, it does happen a few times, can be very tough to get the hang of. I just got used to it and almost never use the strafe or backup keys, but it could be a big hang-up for a lot of people. Also, the game is in true 3D, unlike the Doom engine, which is kind of cheating by projecting the walls to make it look like a 3D space, while in actuality it's mostly 2D. This means that the Underworld engine can actually stack rooms or platforms on top of another, which if you pay close attention to the original Doom is carefully avoided at all costs. This is shown in ways as simple as a bridge over a river lava pit, or even more complicated with angled surfaces and more. However, you will notice there is no mouse look, which unfortunately was still a few years away from being the standard. There is a mod that adds in mouse look, but I have not tried to play around with it, so I'm unsure of how well it works. The normal way of looking up and down is by pressing the 1 and 3 keys to look up and down respectively. This makes the texture warping much more apparent, but it can be very necessary to see different areas or even fight certain creatures that fly above you or lurk on the ground or in the water below you. I got used to all of this control weirdness fairly quickly, but your mileage can vary. Of course, while you're moving around, you'll notice the physics system that I mentioned earlier. The physics system is very comprehensive and consistent, allowing you to do things that should be obvious, like sprinting faster to get longer or higher jumps, but also has consequences such as fast jumps into walls will take health away from you, and tossing objects away from you can result in them becoming out of reach or lost in the water or lava forever. This is one of the many ways in which you can potentially softlock the game, so be very careful not to drop any items near the water as they will become inaccessible. As you start exploring, you will start to run into various races of people. The first thing you'll find out, however, is to not judge a creature by their appearance. Some of the earliest friendly creatures you will find are groups of goblins. Even monsters you would normally fight like trolls and ghouls have communities and will talk with and provide necessary help to you. As we found out in the manual and by talking to various groups of people, a man named Sir Cabrius founded a colony in the Abyss after the events of Ultima VI upon the principles of the 8 virtues. This included inviting all people and species to live together in harmony, but upon his death the tribes fractured and turned on one another. This included the robbing of the 8 talismans of virtue, which naturally you will need to collect to beat the game. Because of all of this, you need to be sensitive to the divides amongst the groups of people while talking to them. On the first floor, the green and grey goblins hate each other, and if you try to insist that they are one and the same, things will probably not end well for you. In fact, this was probably one of my favorite parts of the game. The conversation system. The portraits are good looking, much less ugly than Ultima VI, and typically make it easy to tell important characters apart. The system is there for more than just information dumps though. There are many times where you need to be careful what to say in order to progress. One example is in interacting with the Dwarf King on the 2nd level. First off, he will not take well to being called a dwarf. They prefer mountain folk apparently. He at some point may offer to let you see his treasure hoard. However, if you just say yes, he will basically accuse you of wanting to steal from him and call the guards in on you. There is a way to get access to his hoard, however. If you bribe him with some gold, he will eventually give you the password to get in and access the hoard. And of course now you can take some valuable items like gems and spell scrolls. There are many instances of needing to tread carefully and be strategic with your conversation in order to actually achieve your goals. As frustrated as you may get, you should try to stay humble like the Avatar, and even stroke people's egos when necessary. This is just one of the many things that really helps this world feel very alive. You can also barter with just about every NPC you run into. Even the ones who seem a bit more wary of you will want to trade if you can convince them to trust you. This is the primary way of getting a lot of the better gear in the game, and especially for getting gold coins early on. Everyone will have different things that they want, and they may specify as much in conversation. There are several times where this system is necessary to get vital items, so I will explain how to interact with it in brief. Essentially, after asking for trade, you'll get these little windows that pop up. You can just drag items from your inventory to the little circles next to your pictures, and then highlight items they are offering up by clicking the little plus icons next to them. They will either accept your offer, or ask you for something more different for them to accept. You can also demand they give you stuff, or back out, but like other times you try to demand things from people in this game, it likely won't go very well. That's not very virtuous after all, is it? One thing to be particularly mindful of is paying attention to small details NPCs tell you or instructions they give you. Sometimes it may be useless, but a lot of times a seemingly insignificant detail or item can be useful much later on. For example, a goblin on the first level will be able to give you a recipe for rotworm stew. This is nice as it's a fairly easy source of food, but down on level 4 you will meet a friendly troll who desires a bowl of said stew. Making it for him will result in him giving you the dragon scales, which in turn can be used to make lava-proof boots, making exploring the lower levels so much easier. There are many other examples of this, so don't be too quick to throw away something seemingly useless you get as a reward, and try to remember details you may pick up on. While you wander around meeting these tribes people and leaders, many of them will have tasks you can do for them. These can range from collecting items to defeating fearsome creatures. And that leads us a bit more into a central feature of the game: combat. Just like everything else in the game, the combat takes place in real time and in 3D, making it very different from any previous 3D dungeon crawler or Ultima game. You can easily switch to combat mode by clicking the icon, and that shows your weapon being pulled out, or just your hand if you don't have a weapon equipped. The system is simple enough. Just hold down the left mouse button to charge up your attack, and when the little orb on the bottom left turns green, you can release it to attack. However, where you position your mouse on the screen actually makes a difference in how you attack. If you have played the Elder Scrolls Arena, you may be familiar with this system, but if you aren't, I will still explain it to you anyway. If you put the mouse on the opposite side of your weapon hand and swing, it will do a sideways swing motion. If you put it in the middle of the screen, it will do a sort of stab, and if you put it near the top of the screen and click, it will do kind of an overhead swing or bash depending on the weapon. Maces will obviously be better at bashing overhead, while knives will be better at stabbing and slashing. There are also ranged weapons, which I hardly touch because they suck. Because there's no mouse look or mouse aim, it's pretty hard to actually aim, and the damage ranged weapons seem to do is minimal. Plus, ammo is almost non-existent for both slings and bows, so if you want to go for ranged attacks, it's probably just best to stick with spellcasting. Combat spellcasting is pretty simple. If you have a spell queued up already, you simply need to click on the rune bar to ready it, then click where you want to cast it, if necessary. All of the combat related spells are fairly simple, including the basics such as magic arrows and fireballs, as well as while you progress, you'll be able to access much more powerful spells like paralysis and time stop. When you cast spells, there is however a chance of the spell simply failing or even backfiring, causing you damage. If you're going to rely on spells a lot, you'll want to invest a lot of points into the casting skill, as that will lower your chances of failure and thus keep you from wasting a lot of mana. Speaking of mana, your status is something you'll want to keep a constant eye on. Your health and mana can be replenished by potions, but these are very uncommon and valuable, so you'll probably want to save them for a pinch. Instead, you typically regain these points by sleeping. Because there is no day-night cycle as everything is underground, there's no real reason to wait for certain times to sleep. You will want to, however, ensure that you keep yourself well fed, as point regeneration will be much slower or even non-existent if you are hungry or starving. You can check your hunger level by clicking on the compass. Food is perhaps the number one commodity of the Abyss, as obviously it doesn't grow down here, so you will want to make sure to try to grab it whenever you can. Understandably, you are not the only one who wants food, so many times you need to be willing to trade some for valuable resources or information. Also, sometimes when you sleep, the same face that appeared in your dream at the beginning of the game will appear again, giving you cryptic and incomplete messages. They don't tell you too much, but they can help point you in the right direction if you get lost, and give you more details about the story going forward. If you fail to take care of yourself or succumb in combat, you will of course die, seeing this skull screen. And as this game came out in 1992, there is no autosave, so you will need to load back to your last manual save. So save that game often like you're working on a school project. However, Blue Sky recognized it would be annoying to have to reload every time you died and could potentially result in a soft lock if your only save was a position close to death. So they gave you a way to respawn instead of dying. Fairly early on in the first level, you'll find this area with a small silver tree and banner. If you grab this tree and replant its seed, you'll instead respawn upon death at this location, but with just a little lost experience. Now I thought this was nice, but not super convenient, especially as you descend into the lower levels. But as it turns out, you can replant the seed anywhere in the Abyss that has dirt, and it will send you there when you die. Just make sure to be careful when moving the seed to a new location, as you will not respawn if you die before replanting it and will need to load a save. Another resource you will need to be sure to manage is light sources. Although the settlements will for the most part be fairly well lit, most halls and rooms in the Abyss are close to pitch black. This means you have to have a stockpile of torches, candles, or a lamp and oil to keep things lit up. Each type of light source also affects how much of the area around you gets lit up, meaning that when you finally get a lamp and equip it, things become much easier to spot and navigate. You should also take care to put out your torches and other lights before sleeping, as they will continue to get used up while you rest, and forgetting to extinguish led to many wasted torches on my end. Through combat, you'll slowly gain experience. Although I have not found any definitive answer of how much experience you need to gain to level, it seems to be like previous Ultima games where it starts fairly low and seems to about double for each subsequent level. As I stated in the character creation section, there is no way to actually increase your base attributes through leveling, but skills instead can be upgraded. Skills should be familiar to anyone who's played Dungeons & Dragons or most RPGs, where each skill will improve your aptitude at various tasks. Of course, the problem we run into right away is that our two typical Ultima sources of level ups are missing. Both the shrines and Lord British are separated from us by that big locked door at the entrance. However, luckily for us, Sir Cabrius was kind enough to set up these Ankh shrines on each level. Just as in previous Ultima games, you need to pray at these shrines with a mantra in order to level up. But here, instead of having mantras of virtue, we have a mantra for each skill that you can level up. These mantras of course are not just given to you, they have to be found through various means. Sometimes on the walls near a shrine, sometimes on a random scroll, and sometimes taught to you by various NPCs. Or you can just be a cheating cheater like myself and look them up online. Each time you receive the level up notification, you will likely have several opportunities to level skills, meaning you can just chant whatever mantras you would like to use to level in succession in order to level up skills, sometimes 4 or 5 at a time. I could not find any answer online for how many skill ups you get per level, but it doesn't hurt to keep trying until it tells you it won't work anymore, as there are no negative consequences for just chanting mantras at shrines.
What there may be negative consequences for, however, is spending skill points on worthless abilities.
Unfortunately, a lot of the skills are basically useless or minimally useful just because of the level design and things you actually need to do to be able to beat the game, making a lot of builds you might want to try kind of redundant.
Just as a quick rundown, skills such as sneak and lockpick are basically useless, as stealth opportunities are almost entirely non-existent. Missile because, well, missile weapons suck, and Appraise and Charm because money is not that hard to come by. Other skills such as swimming are not worth investing in, as you can get items and spells that make it unnecessary to swim, and there are even more redundancies like this.
The most useful skills to invest in are mostly the weapon category of your choosing, magic and casting, acrobatics, and defense. Most of these are fairly self-explanatory, such as acrobatics, which reduces fall damage and increases jump height and distance.
You may also consider investing in lore and repair, as these can save you lots of money by allowing you to repair your own gear and identify magical items without the use of an NPC. In the end though, it is entirely up to you, but I found the gameplay experience started to go much smoother when I started leveling up skills that were, well, actually useful.
During all this exploration and gameplay, you will have certainly heard some of the delightful music. Here's a sampling of some of those tracks from the MT32 version. The soundtrack is not super large or varied, with only about a dozen tracks, but for me at least it did a great job supporting the oppressive and mysterious atmosphere the game was going for. Plus, the dynamic soundtrack is pretty well done, not typically having any super abrupt and jarring cuts like Ultima VII had, but instead letting me know what was going on or just reflecting a different environment.
Overall, I think this is a pretty great soundtrack, and one that I have used many times in the background of my videos before.
As you continue to explore deeper, you'll run into more than just enemies to fight and people to talk to, but also puzzles to solve. Some are more environmental and natural, such as finding a different way down when the staircase is blocked by rubble. Some are more straightforward puzzles, such as one where you have to flip certain switches in certain orders to open doors or get platforms in the right locations. And there are a few more that are a bit creative. Probably my favorite is one you need to complete in order to release a character from a prison cell. A few floors down you find this group of lizard people, and while they are intelligent and can communicate, they don't speak English, or whatever it is they call it in Britannia. They have their own language. The person in the prison cell knows their language, but the problem is that he is mute. So in order to figure out what the jailer wants to let him go, you'll need to talk to the lizard people, and then ask the mute monk about the word. He will then mime it to you to try to help you understand it. Eventually you figure out that the guard wants a lot of food in order to release him, but coming to that conclusion is a lot of fun, and also a lot of work. Make sure to take rigorous notes. Honestly, this is one of my favorite puzzles in a video game ever, and I wish I could see this sequence represented in a modern fashion with voice acting and actual character movements. Still though, this is a wonderfully interesting puzzle, and one I definitely recommend trying without a guide, as finding the solution is super rewarding and allows you to converse with the other lizardmen in the settlement. Eventually bits of the larger story will start to trickle in as you descend deeper and explore wider within the abyss. As you continue to search for the whereabouts of the princess, other rumors start to come to light. Something about a powerful wizard down below, but most obvious is these 8 talismans. Some of them you will get by defeating powerful enemies, one by becoming a knight of a holy order, and some from bartering with people that have no idea what they really possess. One item in particular is the sword Caliburn, which has been broken in 2, the hilt and blade carried off to different floors of the abyss. This you will need to take to the blacksmith's shack.
I'm Shaq. I wake up cool.
No, not that shack. This one's name is spelled with a K, and he is one of the most important NPCs you'll run into. Not only can he repair Caliburn, which is indestructible from there on out, but he also can repair any of your equipment and identify items such as talismans. You will likely find yourself coming back to him multiple times throughout the game, even if it is to try to use his anvil and save scum attempting to repair your gear. Anyways, once you get down to the 6th and 7th levels, you'll find out a lot more about what's actually going on here. Apparently there's an evil wizard on the 7th floor who is holding the princess hostage and plans to sacrifice her in some kind of ritual. The problem is the wizard has somehow disabled magic on the 7th floor, meaning if you are doing a magic heavy playthrough, you will really find yourself kneecapped and hit a hard wall at this level. Of course, this is when the difficulty really starts to hit. Sure, you've run into a gazer or two up to this point, but on this level there are tough magma monsters that throw fireballs at you, more gazers, and a hard to see creature called the Shadow Beast that will utterly kick your trash. Honestly, here you need to be ready for anything. Also on this floor there's a high likelihood you will get tossed in prison. The monsters here will demand an amulet to pass, but if you don't have it they will attack. And in one part of the map they'll just imprison you and require a bribe to get out. This location is important as all the prisoners have important information, but we'll get back to that in a few minutes. The other problem is that in order to get into the lair of the evil wizard Tibble, you need to pass through a sort of invisible maze. And not one where the walls are invisible per se, but a room where if you deviate too far from the right path you'll take massive amounts of damage and soon die. Sure, you could trial and error it and painstakingly map it out and make it, or you can do it the way the game designers intended. Elsewhere on this floor there is a big room full of treasure, protected by an imp and several earth golems. In the hoard is an item that will help you navigate Tibble's maze, the Crown of Maze Navigation. Kind of on the nose, but it gets the point across. There is a catch though. First of all, you can't take anything else from the hoard or the imp and golems will attack you. The other part is that he doesn't tell you which crown it is directly, but he does give you a cryptic clue. Once you do find the right one and return to the maze wearing the crown, you will see the path lit up in orange. And if you thought that getting into his lair was hard, you'll hate what comes next. This Tibble fight is really hard. Probably the hardest in the game. Partially because he floats around and uses powerful spells, but also because your magic is still disabled, meaning you can't just heal unless you've been stocking potions. He also has a ton of health, meaning even with a high attack and a sword stat and the Sword of Caliburn, it took me a long time and many attempts to take him down. Once you finally kill him, a small cutscene plays, which is a bit confusing. Essentially, we learned a bit earlier that he intended to sacrifice the princess to free a great demon called the Slasher of Veils, but he insists when you kill him that he actually captured the princess to bind the demon into her body. Now that you killed him, apparently he will soon break free of the Abyss and wreak havoc on Britannia. So I don't really think we should trust the guy that just captured a girl, attempted to sacrifice her, and also disable all the magic on the floor, and is responsible for summoning the Slasher in the first place. Well, guess we have to deal with his mess now. You can destroy the orb in the middle of his chamber to restore magic on the floor, and then go and free the princess from her cell. She says that she will use her amulet of travel to escape and warn her father about the soon-to-be-freed demon. And she can't take us with her, of course. But of course, being the Avatar, we still have to stop the world from being destroyed. Somehow. Luckily, the spirit who appeared to us at the beginning, Tibble's brother Garamon, appears to us to offer some guidance. He says he could more easily communicate with us if we could return his bones to his grave, because apparently Tibble just dug up his bones and moved them somewhere as some sort of act of vengeance or something, I'm not sure. I guess this somehow affects his ability to be a proper spirit or something, I'm not sure. Anyways, we find his bones shoved in a corner down on level 8, and have to haul them all the way back up to level 5 where his original grave was. Upon returning his bones, he becomes a proper spirit and actually has a conversation with you. He tells you that you will need some sort of object or objects of great power to banish the Slasher of Veils to the void, but he isn't really quite sure what to use. Up to this point, we've collected 8 powerful talismans, and if you suggest this to him, he thinks it's a great idea. In order to unleash their power, we'll need to chuck all these into the lava in the Slasher's chamber, which is where the Codex used to be before we chucked that into the void. Which seems a shame, because many of them are super useful, but sacrifices must be made to save the world. He also says that the chamber may require a 3-part key to enter, but he isn't sure. Upon examination of the door to the chamber in the center of the 8th level, you find he is right about the key. Luckily, some unlikely people have the answers. Revisiting the prison you were thrown into on the 7th level after defeating Tibble will allow you to talk to the 3 prisoners you couldn't get to before, who all know the whereabouts of keys or have information which will help you get to them. So one simply requires you to give a picture of a loved one to someone, one requires a special mantra to be chanted at shrines, and one requires you to take a passage all the way up from the 7th floor to the 2nd, fighting tons of enemies along the way, including 2 shadow beasts at the top. After having done this, the last part is fairly straightforward. You use the 3-part key on the door, enter, and toss all the 8 talismans into the pit. This results in what looks like a moon gate that apparently sucks in the Slasher along with yourself. And this place is an acid trip. Like, I don't know what drugs were done, but this void plane or whatever is really bizarre. Apparently you're being chased by the Slasher of Veils or something, but really you just run along the green path until you hit the exit, at which point the ending cutscene plays. No voice acting this time, which is kind of a shame, but I can sum it up. Apparently the exit spits you out on the surface of the island, and you're able to swim and catch the boat leaving the island. The Duke apologizes profusely for not believing you, and throwing you into the abyss. I still think I should be owed financial compensation or the execution of this fraud of a Duke, but whatever. And then apparently what we did caused the volcano on the island to go off.
Doctor, come on, will you? The whole place is going to blow up. Oh, it's quite all right, Jerry. The planet is quite safe. There's just going to be a localized volcanic eruption. It'll only affect the island.
Maybe so, but we happen to be on the island.
Oh, my word!
I don't know if a volcanic eruption quite squares with how we see the island in Ultima VII, but whatever. It at least explains why Hythloth and or the Abyss is not explorable in that game. Though it kind of is, I guess? We'll cross the bridge when we come to it. Anyways, Garamond also congratulates you and tells you he summoned a gate before the island erupted to get all of the citizens of the Abyss away. So you didn't just slaughter dozens of people by blowing everything up. And finally at the end you get a cool congratulations and a stats screen. And that's Ultima Underworld. Overall I found this game to be super fun and a very welcome addition to the Ultima series. It set the bar so high for 3D RPGs that it took several years for competitors to start to catch up and offer products that even approached the level of detail and technical prowess this game set. The developers at Blue Sky and later Looking Glass were truly wizards, getting this groundbreaking game to run as well as it does on the original hardware. This is also a very easy game to recommend to anyone interested in RPGs or fantasy games, as it's mostly straightforward and doesn't really rely on Ultima lore or weird mechanics to work. And it of course is cheaply available alongside its sequel on GOG.com. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to like, subscribe, and turn notifications on so you can see my upcoming content. I have a few videos in various stages of development, including a review on the recently released System Shock remake, the DOS port of NBA Jam, and Worlds of Ultima 2, Martian Dreams. Let me know if there's any other games you would like to see me play and review. Thanks again, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week.